you're thinking, why am I here? I'm here because history and investing actually go together. Example, I was looking at the U.S. Budget debate this morning, and one of our congressmen, Paul Ryan, is being picked apart for his budget. Underlying the discussion about the U.S. budget is the question of how much we should spend. So we asked the question in the U.S., how much should the government spend? And the answer or comes in a very broad range, right? How much should the U.S. spend? The answer is a lot or really a lot, right? There's no, I am joking, there's no we should not spend, right? It's such a, we run the gamut from A to B, as we say in music. It's spending or a lot of spending. There are no other choices in the U.S. Discussion. Underlying that is an assumption that, and held by many of us all over the world, that the U.S. government cannot not spend, right? And why can't the U.S. government stop spending? Well, we kind of believe that a government has to spend for an economy to grow, right? And the second thing is we couldn't get anyone who was opposed to spending elected anyhow, right? And well, if we're opposed and we elect someone and he says no, well, what's going to happen to him? He's going to get de-elected, right? And then somebody worse will come in, somebody who really spends. And those are the parameters of our discussion. Even Ronald Reagan, the great conservative president, well, he spent more in office, didn't he? Right? When we talk about cutting spending in the U.S., we aren't really cutting spending. We're reducing the increase in spending. That's the lingo. So why am I here? In these very short remarks, I only have one thing to say. It is possible for a U.S. leader to say no, to keep saying no, not to hurt the economy, maybe even to help the economy. And there was a president, even in the past, not even that far away, not like a founder or something, in the 20th century who did that. That was this obscure President Calvin Coolidge, who served in the 1920s and even managed to get elected after he said no, back into office. Why don't we know about him? Well, we have a sort of amnesia. That's why George brought me here and from Watsa to address that amnesia of not knowing history. History can repeat itself. Just as investment patterns can. We say it doesn't always repeat itself precisely, but sometimes it rhymes. In American history, what would our kids get in school, what we got in school, Coolidge isn't just, you haven't heard of him, neither has any U.S. citizen, practically, if you are not from the U.S. He's not just obscure, he's really obscure. I think I have his picture up here. His nickname was Silent Cal. He would sit at tables like this at dinners. He truly was silent. There was a lady who sat next to him at a dinner, kind of a socialite lady, and she said, "Mr. Coolidge, I made a bet tonight I could make you say more than 2 words. And what did Coolidge say to her? "You lose." He was serious about his silence, and you can see that when he smiled, he didn't show his teeth. The daughter of a much more activist President Theodore Roosevelt, Alice Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, said of Coolidge all around Washington, she said this, "He looks as though he's been weaned on a pickle." What do you think? So there he is. All right, well, Coolidge. What you need to know, he served 67 months, a term and a half. Only thing you need to know is that when he left office, even though the economy was growing at 4% and the population expanding, what was the fact? The fact was the federal budget was actually lower than when he'd come in. Not just reduced, increased, actually lower. Well, how did he do that? And I lied, actually. There's one other thing you need to know about him. The taxes were very high when he came into government before. And when he left office, his top marginal income tax rate was 25%. That's lower than Ronald Reagan's 28%. So here's a Scrooge. If he's a Scrooge, as George said, who begat plenty. And how'd he do that? And that's what I'm going to review for you this morning. Now you know why I'm here. If Coolidge were a stock, he'd be a buy. He's a value stock. No one recognized him yet. It's a good story. Part of the story is political process and device, technicalities as in your work, but part is human temperament. And it takes a minute or two to tell, which is why I'm grateful to you, to this business school, to Brian for that lovely introduction this morning. It was Mr. Watsa years ago who invited me to speak about the sequel to this prequel, Forgotten Man. And a lot of other companies followed him in trying to learn from these books. So my story this morning, though, begins in a time somewhat parallel to now. We had just come out of a great disruption. In that instance, it wasn't a financial crisis. It was World War I, which had felt like a financial crisis. As you probably know, in World War I, the U.S. government did some wild things. For example, our major industry in that period was railroading. That was our internet, right? It's something we thought that had a lot of promise. We had nationalized our railroad and then denationalized our railroad rather violently. We had our debt was up by 10 times. Our budget was up by 10 times. We'd always had a very small government. After World War I, certain areas of our economy were doing very well. One was energy, but other areas not so well. Taxes were rather high, and we had a kind of stubborn youth unemployment. Some of it sounds familiar. And the U.S. also thought it might spend some more. It was a progressive mood, as now. I'm sure you've been noticing that. Well, when we came out of World War I, the top marginal rate on the income tax in the United States was 73%, and the way they treated capital gains was even worse. They didn't have a high rate. They had no rate. The courts were deciding what the rate was. So that's not very pleasant, right? To have probably a high rate, but not certain. That was the investment environment. Two groups were seeking a greater gift from the government, and they were key groups. One was farmers. Farmers mattered a lot more in those days because a good number of our citizens still lived on the land. They were seeking some kind of permanent subsidy arrangement. We'd never had that in peacetime in the U.S. before. And the second group was veterans. And again, veterans sound small, but in that period after a war, they were a large group because we had universal conscription in World War I. We had no antibiotics after World War I. 1/3 of those vets came back disabled with the prospect of a lifetime of pain, and they were seeking a payment, what we called the bonus. And they were pressing upon the government to spend more. The way this starts to get interesting as a story, though, is one party did run on a ticket of no. That party happened to be the Republican Party, with two candidates. One was a very ebullient senator from Ohio named Warren Harding. I think I have his picture. Wait, hold on, right here. Warren Harding is the one with the lighter hat, right, on my left. He was a friendly man, and that plays in this story. And the other was this really tight-mouthed, you can see Coolidge with a tight-mouthed fellow who had been born farm territory in Vermont and grown up in Massachusetts, a governor from Massachusetts. And they ran on a ticket. They had a motto that, again, sounds distant but is actually close. They had a motto called normalcy. We want normalcy for the country. That's the way Harding said it. And when we study that in the history books in the U.S., and when you study it too, we kind of make fun of that. He wanted everyone to be normal, like a cog, right? That's the kind of impression you get when you hear about normalcy. That doesn't sound very attractive. But when I went back to research this book, I discovered something interesting. By normalcy, they did not mean that people had to be normal. They meant the environment, please let it be normal so I can have fun. Very different, right? Predictability. And Coolidge was a stickler for English and grammar. He didn't really like the word normalcy. It sort of sounded like it was mixing Greek and Latin or something. So he put what they sought, what this ticket sought in this politically uncertain time another way. He said, we want to reduce economic uncertainty, much closer to where we are now. Anyhow, they won. That's the first thing. This party of no, remember, normalcy, and even starts with the letters N-O. And Harding did say no at first. He passed an important law, a law we lack now, called the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. A very interesting law, gave the executive more authority. This law was undone in the 70s. It gave the executive in the United States the power to sequester, to hold back money that had already been allocated through a budget law if he felt a department did not need it. And it gave him a research arm to inspect, gave him his own CFO to inspect what was going on, to audit the government from within. So Harding said no to the farmers. He did cut taxes down to the 50s from the 70s. He planned a project that sounds very worthy, where the government had all this excess energy reserves. Out west, he said, well, we should privatize that sounded sort of interesting. For the veterans, he didn't want to give them pensions, but he cut an artful deal. He would not pay them a monthly payment, that would be an entitlement, but he would build them hospitals, start what we think of now as the Veterans Administration. But you want to remember what I said about temperament. It's not just what you say, it's who you are. Harding's program said no, his party said no, but his heart said yes. He was a very lovable and much loved man, and he liked it that way. He got tired of tax cutting. It's hard to cut taxes in prosperity, and by the mid-20s we had that. He got tired of telling people he was going to veto, right? He got tired of prohibition. Remember, this is a period of no liquor, and people, they said they had a lot of liquor at the White House. They kind of ignored the law, flaunted, right? People, in fact, people said that people went to the Harding White House for, quote unquote, food and action. What does that mean, right? Action. That's very interesting, right? He was a party man of the fraternity variety, not just a party political man. And the things he did a little sloppily. He tended to appoint his friends to jobs, maybe friends who weren't good enough for the job, maybe friends who were crooked. And that worthy energy privatization out west became not a good experiment in libertarianism. It became a scandal because he gave the money to people who gave the money to their friends' Teapot Dome. Maybe you've heard of that. And that besmirched his name. Even his help for the veterans, in Harding's case, went wrong because the man hired to run the veteran hospitals took so many kickbacks, he ended up in Leavenworth Prison. So that's what happens when you execute a job sloppily. Harding was an endearing man, and he knew that he was fouling up, that he was messing up, and he said, I can take care of my enemies in a fight, but it's my friends, my darn friends, who keep me walking the floor at night. His presidency began to fizzle as scandal filled the air. And his father told a sort of dirty joke about him, which I hope you don't mind me telling you. It's not that dirty. And when I tell it to younger people, they don't even understand it. His father, President Harding's father, said they should never have elected Warren Harding because of the way he was. He always said yes. It was a good thing President Harding wasn't a girl, because if he were a girl, he'd always be in the family way. Can you imagine the president's father? So as you probably know, President Harding, alas, died. Another year, a revisionist, perhaps Jim Grant, will present the defense of Harding to you. And his vice president, that quiet, mousy man who always said no, from Massachusetts and Vermont, became president. And this was in 1923, so people were sure that, what do you think, 1923, you're counting the months, you're pretty good at arithmetic. Oh, lame duck, right? He just has one term, it's almost over. That Coolidge would do nothing, but Coolidge was a different temperament. His plan said no, his party said no, and his heart said no as well. He was a budget man. Every aspect of his being was about the budget, right down to the pets that they kept. The mayor of Johannesburg in South Africa sent President Coolidge a present. And what do you name an animal? 2 lion cubs. What do you name an animal when you're president in the White House? You name it Barney, right? Or something sweet, right? What did President Coolidge name his 2 gift lion cubs that he got? He named them Budget Bureau and Tax Reduction. And one of the things about those lion cubs is that they were twins, right? And he didn't want any little big, he didn't want a big, fat lion called tax reduction and some kind of runt who comes after called Budget Bureau. He kept them even Steven, right? He liked the symmetry. He fed them on steak to make a political point, right? I'm not quite the modern supply-sider. I won't cut the tax rate so easily if I don't cut the budget as well. And I'm going to read to you rather than tell you some of his statements. You can get the feel of his vehemence and commitment. I am for economy, and after that, I am for more economy. We must have no carelessness in our dealing with public property. Imagine President Coolidge. Or the expenditure of public money. Such a condition is characteristic of undeveloped people. Ooh, shame, right? He did not hesitate to shame people who spent too much. Taxes, well, 50% range where Harding had left it, that was too high. Coolidge was going to get that tax rate down. If you look in the statistics of income at the rates from the 1920s, you'll say that wasn't so hard. A year or 2 after he came in, Coolidge had got it down to 25, because you can see the rate is 25% by the mid-20s. But that's deceptive, because if you actually follow the history, you'll see it wasn't until 1926, or several years into the presidency, that Coolidge managed to get the top marginal rate down to 25%. Why is it deceptive? Because Coolidge's tax cuts were retroactive. Talk about a gesture to build political trust. I'm not going to just give you something. I'm going to give you something to make up the wrong of before, to show I really mean it. Under promise, over deliver. The budget, this was an amazing display by Coolidge. He not only budgeted, he budgeted ruthlessly. For the book, we quantified how he did it. He met with his budget director 50 times a year. Now, and if you know anything about White House, or in fact any government, you know for anyone to meet with the president or leader 50 times a year is almost impossible. Not even his wife gets that, right? And yet Coolidge did that and never flagged all the way to 1927, towards the end of his presidency. They had a meeting rather like this, a command performance too, of all the departments of government under Coolidge, as they were able to do this under the authority of that law. And Coolidge would sit gentlemen like yourselves and ladies and harass and shame them into spending less in their department. First, he created a 2% club for the department that voluntarily reduced its budget beyond the demanded reductions. And what do you get when you fit in that 2% club, when you qualify? What? A sticker, right? Sort of like kindergarten, like first grade. And then when the departments couldn't cut anymore, he created a 1% club for the nice department that managed to cut its budget an additional 1%, and you get what? Another sticker? He's very, very serious about it. And then after a while, the departments couldn't cut anymore, because I told you the U.S. economy was growing at 4%. And being from New England or the woods and all, he and his budget director they created the Woodpecker Club for the department that manages to peck away at its budget here and there. Oh, these are serious budget cutters, right? They do not give up. It is better to kill a bad law than to pass a good one, he said. Interesting piece of advice, very low-key. He told his father that when his father was a lawmaker. Coolidge vetoed, we counted 50 times while he was executive, because that was his temperament. He vetoed the farm bills twice. People thought he might be soft on the farm bills. His father had a cheese factory. His town was very poor where he was born. And I'm going to just repeat to you the lines of an encounter of how Coolidge turned down the farm lobby. The farm lobby came to the president and said, please, could we have some supports for our prices? And Coolidge said, long pause. There are always pauses with Coolidge. Well, farmers never have made much money. Pause. Don't suppose they ever will. Pause. Don't suppose there's much we can do about it. Pause. No farm support. He vetoed the vets, of course. He vetoed postal money. He vetoed disaster relief, and they had a Katrina in that period, the flood of the Mississippi. This is all in the book. You know, this has to do so much with temperament in terms of what tools you pick. What tool would a silent guy pick, a legislative tool or an executive tool? Not just the veto. Coolidge favored what we call the pocket veto. And why is that? Because in the United States, a pocket veto, which happens over recess, does not require any message from the president. He can just kill a law like that, a bill, and Congress cannot override him and has to start over with a new law. Coolidge wasn't just good at the pocket veto, which requires some guile. You have to get Congress to pass that law pretty close to the recess so you can kill it by inaction. Coolidge wasn't just good at the pocket veto, he was a regular Isaac Stern of the pocket veto. He was a maestro of the pocket veto. He constantly lured Congress into passing things he would then kill. And this saving of money went right all the way down, not just to the pets, I mentioned the lions before, but to every detail in the White House. There was a housekeeper in the White House named Mrs. Jaffray who loved to spend at the specialty shops, and she and Coolidge came to blows one day at a seating like this. She had all the food out for all the visiting diplomats who were going to come to the meal, and she said, "Look, President Coolidge, aren't you proud of this great display?" You know how in the U.S. we talk about pork, by which we mean excessive spending, unnecessary spending. Coolidge took pork literally. He looked at the display and said, "Mrs. Jaffray, there are too many hams. It's an awful lot of ham you're serving here." And pretty soon, Mrs. Jaffray was gone. This kind of tight behavior did not always make Coolidge beloved. In Washington, you think of the MasterCard commercial, right? How is Washington? Run into the president on the street, good. Meeting with the president somewhere on the hill, really good. Meeting with the president at his own breakfast table, priceless, right? Everyone wants that, no matter what. But interestingly, people actually turn down this Scrooge president for breakfast invitations. He served maple syrup, right? Remember Vermont, and waffles and so on. And yet the lawmakers, after a while, wouldn't come. And an usher at the White House kept a list of the no RSVPs, kind of out of malice. And I'm going to read to you all the reasons people came up with that they couldn't dine with their chief executive. Let's see. Senator Heflin, regret, sick. Senator Pittman, regret, sick. Senator Reed of Missouri, sick friend. That's a very lame excuse, but this is my favorite. Senator Norris of Nebraska, unable to locate. You get the feeling, right? But I'm going to stop there and say, everyone did well. And outside Washington, the non-politicians appreciated Coolidge very much. How much? You remember I mentioned he was a lame duck before becoming president, the accident of an accident in 1923. He did have to run again, or really run as president the first time in 24. In the US, when we have a three-party election, that's often bad for Republicans. You think of President Bush 41, who lost to President Clinton because Ross Perot came in, right? Well, there was a three-party election in 1924. The progressives were coming on strong, and they claimed 17% of the vote. So it's Republicans, Democrats, and progressives. What's astounding about Coolidge is that as a Republican, he won not only a plurality, but actually claimed an absolute majority, beating Democrats and progressives combined with a platform of no. And in 28, when he had a chance to run again, because he did, and he chose not to, modesty, like Lord Acton, the Republican Party, which is one of the most neurotic animals in existence, then as now, had a nervous breakdown because they could not imagine victory without Calvin Coolidge. So what are the takeaways here, and why am I telling you this as we speak in 2014. One is laws matter. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 is obscure, repealed, and forgotten. But without a certain law which gave the executive more power of oversight, we could not have cut the budget as we did in the 1920s, going back, retreating back from the wartime expenditure. A second is that political trust matters. If someone trusts you, as you know, they'll come back again. Coolidge made every effort to avoid scandal, not just because he was a prude, but also because he needed that capital of trust to make serious policy steps elsewhere. That's why scandal is bad. It costs you political capital, and he recognized that in the very deepest way. A third is respect for federalism mattered. Coolidge loved the states. When he pronounced the name the United States, he pronounced it as a plural. The United States are. He didn't speak of the federal government. He said the national government in Washington. He understood that the states were models. Very important for you is that this naysaying by a U.S. leader and this cutting can be good for the economy. Today, I worked with President Bush on the 4% growth project, an economic project. Frankly, that phrase was aspirational. We don't have 4% growth in the United States. It was kind of a hope and a dream. Coolidge did average real 4% growth. The patent rate, which is key and something that I and many of you probably look at, was exquisitely high in the 1920s. It was a period when of great success for the middle class, notwithstanding the Gatsby cliches. That was the decade in which Americans got indoor plumbing. I rest my case. Great decade, right? Other factors, I would mention to you is that temperament matters, just as in business. The executive couldn't do what the executive did, take these difficult steps, if he hadn't been inclined temperamentally to take them. I will close with just 2 points I think you might want to ask. But didn't Calvin Coolidge precede the Great Depression and therefore cause it? So I would answer that rather monosyllabically, as Coolidge wouldn't say no. But we could talk about it if you wanted. And the other is, isn't today different? I don't think today is as different as we suppose. As this book, the Coolidge book, was coming out, Mrs. Thatcher died. And so I had cause to think of her and recall her. And you want to remember that in, say, the early 70s, the Tory party never dreamed it would hire an angry woman to head its government, right? It was all about conciliation. It would not hire a woman who was determined, or any character who was determined about tightening up in government. But yet, when the interest rate rose and the trouble came in Britain, of course, Mrs. Thatcher was just exactly who many voters wanted. Right now, at this minute, with interest rates where they are, a Coolidge or cutting figure does not seem intensely necessary. But as you know, being in the field you're in, things can change overnight, and suddenly everyone will be looking for heroes. Could the U.S. have a leader who would cut the budget in a speech about no? Of course, I will close by saying yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Amity. We have some time for a couple of questions. You want to ask Amity? Summer? Where's the mic?
Can you?
Sure. Yeah. I'm listening. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on the no comment about his role or influence into the Depression? Can you comment on your answer to no about his influence regarding the Depression?
Comment on the Great Depression?
Sorry, you talked about Coolidge's role in the Depression.
Well,
and you said no. Can you just elaborate your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, remember, that's why he's not famous. But post hoc ergo propter. Just because something follows something doesn't mean it was caused by it. Specifically, in the period when Coolidge was president, there was no Securities and Exchange Commission. So no one believed it was the role of Washington to regulate the stock market. Then in New York, they did that with the Martin Act, right? And he actually had been governor in Massachusetts when Charles Ponzi did Ponzi schemes and had been the regulator of Charles Ponzi, effectively, and changed it. So that was a different time. Two, in his lifetime, Coolidge's life is interesting because it about parallels that of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. He came online, graduated from college in '95. So if you go back and look at all the at the Dow up till he became president, the Dow crashed numerous times in his life without any big Great Depression. Crashed violently. I think it's 6 or 7. I should have brought that chart. So Coolidge didn't expect that a market crash would be followed by a Great Depression. Finally, I don't think if he could have acted, he would have, because he did not believe in too big to fail. He believed in moral hazard. So if Wall Street crashes, it's very unpleasant. It shouldn't. But how much worse if we get involved would have been his position. That's the beginning of an answer. It's a long one. He was extremely unnerved by the fact that the Dow went that high. If you look at the Dow, as many of you know, it went up to 381 from around 100 when he came into Washington. I don't have the chart in front of me, but that's what I'm thinking. Especially at the very end of his presidency, it went up that last 180 into the time of his successor. He didn't like that. You can see in his own portfolio that he bought, he tried to hedge. But he didn't think it was the job of the executive to say something about that the market had to correct itself. And in my book, The Forgotten Man, my next book, I make the case about the Great Depression and what made it so great and long, and most of those things don't start with C.
Another question? Over there.
Yeah, you want to call him? Yeah.
Yes, obviously you have a great grasp of U.S. history during that period. Just a couple of things. I read an account of, I think one of the New England governors, there was some horrible Katrina windstorm in New England, and everything was just blown down, and they actually refused aid from the federal government, I believe. They did not make any kind of an appeal, said we can take care of it ourselves, even though people were homeless, people were dead, everything was pretty much destroyed. So there was that kind of, I guess, anti, depending on the federal government, attitude among the several states for the most part, I think, back then. And then you get into, this transition, and some have made, a lot of, rather a big point about, during, I guess, his administration when the Great Mississippi Flood hit, and you said, he vetoed money to spend down there, but I think the federal government did get involved in a big way in some way, and Hoover himself was kind of in charge of leading those relief efforts, but was that actually funded by the federal government or just kind of supported by the federal government?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think if you had interviewed Coolidge, he would have said the hardest thing in my presidency was not the stock market, which made me nervous. It was the natural disasters. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Coolidge viewed himself, as a boy with his finger in a dike, the dike of spending, and floods make spending happen, right? Literal floods make floods of money. It just seems that because nobody can bear a snapshot of suffering. It's just like that. So Coolidge didn't believe it was the job of the federal government to manage disaster relief, and certainly not the job to provide the infrastructure to prevent future disaster. They had a terrible flood in the South, and there's a few wonderful books about it. In 1927, the flood of the Mississippi, hundreds of thousands were displaced. It was in many states. The water was 50 feet high. It was just unimaginable. Coolidge, as president, believed those people should be helped. The Red Cross, which was a bigger entity and closer to the government in those days, went down. The government led an enormous fundraising drive to help out in the South, but he didn't believe a government department should spend, so he didn't go down. He sent his Commerce Secretary, who was inclined to intervene, kind of a Chris Christie, or a Mitt Romney more, Herbert Hoover, down to the South, and that's what you're remembering. Well, the Southerners didn't quite get that because it was a terrible flood. They said, well, if it were his own neighborhood, if there were a flood in Vermont, he would go. He just doesn't care about the South. And it's kind of as divine retribution. As it happened, there was a terrible flood in Vermont later that year, just as recently, you recall Irene. And Vermont was wrecked. Vermont's a poor state with few prospects. It's all rocks, right? It's hard, it's not arable. They had too much railroad. The railroads were 50 or 100 railroad bridges were washed away. The lieutenant governor was drowned getting out of his car. It was that flashy and bad a flood. And Coolidge did not go home because, as the Vermonter said, you can't do for your own what you don't do for others when you're a political leader. That was so dramatic and very hard for the Coolidges, by the way. He went back a year later, and Vermont greeted him with open arms, but it was quite a dramatic display. Why didn't he do it? It wasn't because he was cold. It was because there were enormous infrastructure spending bits of legislation before him on his desk. And had he gone to Vermont or to the South, his veto would have been overridden, right? He's a hypocrite too. It would have been evidence that he was a hypocrite. So, and he didn't go. The spending you're referring to, there was some, but nowhere near as much as there would have been had he made a very public display of government having a big role in disaster. So that was a trial for him very late in his presidency, not easy and causing considerable distress, but he was standing on principle. So thank you for that question.